You think you know the boundaries of human behavior. You think there are lines even the most desperate or twisted would never cross. But sometimes history hides families in plain sight, families whose darkest acts never reached the newspapers, whose shame was buried beneath generations of silence. Tonight, I am going to take you into one of those families, a family where love, or what they called love, twisted into something so grotesque it can still haunt the living. A family where one man, already marked by the consequences of generations of inbreeding, married his own sister. And what followed would unravel the fragile notion that there are safe, untouchable corners of human morality. It begins, as most tragedies do, in isolation. A small town, far from the bustle of state capitals, a place where everyone knows everyone else, and yet everyone knows nothing. The family in question had lived there for decades, quietly, invisibly. The father, a man of stern habits and colder eyes, had passed down a legacy of rigid obedience, religious piety, and an unspoken rule: never question what happens behind closed doors. From the outside, they seemed normal, even pious. The kind of family that shows up to church every Sunday, smiles at neighbors, keeps a neat house. But inside, generations of genetic bottlenecking were slowly eroding the lines between sanity and madness, between affection and obsession. The man at the center of this story, who we will call Samuel, was unlike anyone else in the town. He was physically frail, his features oddly blended, an echo of too many repeated bloodlines. He carried the unmistakable mark of inbreeding, though few would ever call it out. And yet, for all his oddities, he possessed a charisma that made people hesitate, an almost hypnotic persistence that drew the lonely, the curious, the vulnerable. Samuel had siblings, of course. But there was one sister, Anna, who seemed to occupy a space that was both familiar and dangerously intimate. To outsiders, she was just a shy girl, withdrawn but obedient, carrying the same physical telltale signs of generations of tightly wound family genetics. But to Samuel, she was more than a sister. She became the focus of a desire that would destroy the boundary between familial love and something far darker. What makes this story unbearable is how natural it began. There was no screaming, no public scandal, no immediate horror to warn the town. Instead, there was quiet attention, gestures that seemed innocent to anyone untrained to see the signals. Samuel would spend hours near her, watching her, speaking softly, finding excuses to be alone with her. And Anna, conditioned to obedience, conditioned to family hierarchy, did not resist. At first, it was a shared solitude. Playing games, walking along dusty paths behind the house, reading books together. But the subtle shift, the first crossing of a boundary, is almost imperceptible until it is far too late. And then the marriage happened, not a loud, scandalous ceremony, not a celebration, but a quiet arrangement sanctioned perhaps by desperation, perhaps by denial. The town records, if you dig deep enough, list it plainly. Samuel married Anna, the same Anna who shared his blood, whose DNA had been recycled through their family for generations. Some of the older neighbors whispered, but whispers are easy to dismiss, and no one dared pry too deeply. The horror was contained within the walls of their home, within the silences of family meals, in the careful avoidance of eye contact with anyone who might have suspected. Inside the house, though, the story was very different. The psychological tension was constant, like a storm that never fully breaks. Samuel's obsessions intensified. Every decision Anna made, every movement, every choice of friend or dress or habit, became scrutinized. And Anna, conditioned from childhood to obey, to maintain peace, began to shrink into herself. There was no escape, no safe confessional. She was trapped within her own bloodline. And Samuel, consumed by his own perception of destiny, saw himself not as a brother, not as a perpetrator, but as someone fulfilling an inevitability. This is the part of the story that makes most people look away. The world outside these walls continued as if nothing had changed. Neighbors went to work, children went to school, and the sun rose and fell. But inside, the dynamics of control, obsession, and genetic inevitability were shaping not just their lives, but the very essence of the family. Children would come later, of course, and each birth carried the compounded risk of what generations of isolation and inbreeding had created. Yet, for Samuel and Anna, this reality was either ignored or rationalized as fate. And in the quiet, in the darkness, a question lingers. How much of this was choice, and how much was the inescapable pull of lineage? The more you dig into this family, the more the lines between nature and nurture, love and pathology, blur until they are almost meaningless. By the time the town started noticing small signs, children who were unusually fragile, traits that seemed eerily familiar, decades had already passed. By then, the secret was woven so tightly into the fabric of the household that it could not be undone without shattering everything. Samuel and Anna's story is not one that concludes neatly, with justice served or horror revealed. It is a slow, grinding revelation, a descent into a private hell that history has often tried to ignore. Because what they did challenges the comforting narratives we tell ourselves about morality, about family, about what is sacred. And it is precisely the quietness of their actions, the banality of the evil, that makes it so psychologically harrowing. As the years unfolded, the household became its own universe, governed by rules only Samuel seemed to articulate and enforce. The walls of that home held whispers, not just from the living, but from memory itself. A memory steeped in repetition, in patterns of obsession and control that had been passed down like heirlooms. Neighbors noticed little. They saw Anna emerge occasionally to buy groceries or attend church, her expression blank, her movements quiet, but they never saw the suffocating microcosm inside the house. Samuel was careful, deliberate. He had learned, over years of observation, how to hide the unnatural intensity of his attentions, how to cloak obsession in normalcy. To the outside world, he was the awkward, almost pitiable man who loved his sister. But inside, the lines had already collapsed. Anna, for her part, lived in a constant state of negotiation between fear, duty, and a strange, conditioned loyalty. She could not articulate the horror she felt, because horror in her world was banal, woven into the fabric of daily life. When Samuel's gaze lingered too long, when his insistence became unbearable, she would retreat into silence, her compliance a shield against confrontation. Her own identity had been eroded by years of subtle psychological coercion. She was not a victim in the dramatic, easily recognized sense. She was a participant, conditioned and broken down, trapped by blood and by an unspoken, generational inevitability. The children they produced became both a source of terror and a mark of continuity. Each birth carried genetic consequences that compounded with each generation, creating features and vulnerabilities that outsiders instinctively labeled different, without knowing why. Fragile health, unusual facial symmetry, and behaviors that were both disturbing and alien. To the community, they were simply children of an odd, reclusive family. But to anyone who knew the history, these children were physical proof of the deep, ongoing corruption within a single lineage. Every glance at them was a reminder of what had been hidden, of the slow, inexorable creep of inherited pathology. Samuel's obsession extended beyond Anna and their immediate children. He tried to control every facet of her life, every relationship, every decision. If she interacted with anyone outside the family, he watched, he listened, he evaluated every word she said. He transformed the home into a fortress of psychological imprisonment, and yet the horror of it was never overt. There were no screaming matches, no clear acts of violence. The terror was the erasure of autonomy, the constant, gnawing presence of a will imposed upon another human being. It was slow, insidious, and infinitely more devastating than sudden brutality. The town eventually started noticing cracks, little things at first, a child's curious but unsettling behavior, Anna's reluctance to speak openly about her life, Samuel's absence from communal gatherings except in brief, controlled appearances. People whispered about how isolated the family had become, how strange the household dynamics seemed. But as with so many horrors hidden within the American landscape, nobody wanted to dig too deep. There is a cultural unease with confronting the grotesque within familiar confines, a tendency to turn away from discomfort. And so, the family continued their quiet, self-contained nightmare, largely unseen, unchallenged, almost mythic in its secrecy. Inside, the psychological tension only grew. Samuel's obsession was mirrored by Anna's resignation. She developed a complex mix of fear, loyalty, and perhaps even distorted affection, what psychologists would later describe as trauma bonding. Every attempt at resistance was met not with violence, but with subtle punishment, withdrawal of approval, moments of cold neglect, the silent judgment that eroded her sense of self. And the children, too young to comprehend, absorbed the unspoken rules of a household where blood and power were inseparable. The patterns of manipulation, of control, of obsessive attachment were being replicated in miniature within their own developing psyches. It was in this second generation, the children of Samuel and Anna, that the most haunting consequences became visible. A boy born with slight deformities, a girl whose features betrayed the cumulative effects of generations of inbreeding, these children were living symbols of a family trapped within itself, reproducing not just genetically, but psychologically. Observers who encountered them sensed something unsettling, though no one could name it. Something in the eyes, the movements, the interactions that betrayed an invisible weight pressing down from the previous generation. It was as if the house itself exhaled its darkness into the next set of inhabitants, passing on the legacy of its secrets and obsessions. By now, the story of Samuel and Anna was no longer just about forbidden desire. It had become a cautionary study of isolation, control, and the way trauma accumulates like sediment, layer upon layer, until even the youngest cannot escape it. It is a truth so uncomfortable that the natural response is denial. Families do not want to believe that one of their own could cross lines, that civilization itself marks as sacred. Communities do not want to acknowledge the horror festering in their midst. And yet, if you dig, if you pry just beneath the surface of a carefully curated existence, you will find that these lines are not impermeable. They can be breached, they can be obliterated, and when that happens, the results are as quiet as they are devastating. If you're still watching, you're already braver than most. Tell us in the comments, what would you have done if this was your bloodline? It was only when the children began interacting with others outside the home that the inevitable exposure became possible. Odd behaviors, fragile health, and genetic traits that had been suppressed in previous generations became undeniable. Teachers, neighbors, and extended family began to notice discrepancies that could no longer be ignored. And when whispers turned to questions, the fortress of secrecy began to strain. Samuel, ever the meticulous guardian of his obsession, fought to maintain control, but he could not contain the reality that had grown beyond his reach. And therein lies the cruelest irony. Samuel had thought himself master of his universe, untouchable in his ability to bend reality to his will. But the consequences of generations of inbreeding, the slow erosion of normalcy, and the emergence of innocent lives burdened with inherited instability, made it impossible to sustain his carefully constructed world. The horror, once hidden behind closed doors, began to leak into the daylight, forcing confrontation with the very truths the family had been conditioned to avoid. The slow unraveling of the family's secret was neither dramatic nor immediate. There was no cinematic confrontation, no sudden revelation. The exposure came in whispers, in half-glimpsed truths, in the quiet horror of neighbors noticing patterns they had previously ignored. Children's illnesses, unusual physical traits, and social oddities could no longer be rationalized. Friends of the children asked questions. Teachers wrote notes. Even distant relatives, long kept at arm's length, began to perceive the weight of something unspeakable lurking within the family. And with each small breach, the carefully maintained fortress of secrecy began to crack. Samuel, who had lived his life with a grim certainty that fate had chosen him for this perverse union, began to experience the first flickers of panic. Not the panic of a man facing punishment, but the panic of one realizing that control, even absolute control, can never extend beyond the confines of the body and the mind. The children, innocent and unknowing, were carriers of a truth too heavy for any one person to contain. They embodied not only genetic consequence, but the psychological imprint of decades of coercion, obsession, and moral distortion. And Anna, who had survived through compliance and silence, now confronted a terrifying reality that the past could not remain buried. The town responded with a mixture of fascination, fear, and polite avoidance. Those who stumbled upon fragments of the story recoiled instinctively. Parents kept their children away from the house. Churchgoers whispered, glancing over their shoulders. Outsiders, drawn by rumors, often reported an almost spectral feeling upon entering the property, an air of oppressive control, of quiet despair, of something that should not exist, but does, still palpable in the furniture, the walls, the very rooms themselves. This family had become a living archive of generational trauma, a psychological mausoleum whose history no one wished to catalogue fully, yet none could entirely ignore. As the children grew, the consequences of Samuel and Anna's actions became increasingly apparent. Health issues, developmental delays, and social alienation marked their lives. But perhaps even more damning was the inherited psychology, the subtle, almost invisible ways in which obsession and control had been passed from parent to child. Each child bore the imprint of the family's dark legacy, their behaviors echoing the twisted hierarchy Samuel had enforced. And though no one could articulate it, even outsiders sensed a continuity of unease, that the darkness, while personal, was also generational, a force that transcended individual choice and lingered like a shadow across time. And here, the horror deepens. The community itself, by choosing ignorance, became complicit. Every glance away, every polite silence, every refusal to investigate, allowed the cycle to continue, allowed the family to remain largely unchallenged for decades. This is the quiet cruelty of hidden trauma. It does not announce itself. It seeps into everyday life, unnoticed, normalized, until the boundary between normalcy and horror is permanently blurred. The children, in turn, internalize these lessons. To them, the home was the center of the world, and the distortions of love and family were simply truth. The outside world, then, was alien, confusing, and threatening. Their reality had been carefully constructed to mirror the psychological prison their parents had built decades earlier. Samuel, now older, more aware of the cracks, oscillated between delusion and despair. He had achieved his singular, twisted vision of life, but at a cost beyond reckoning. The marriage that had once seemed inevitable now revealed itself as a chain binding not only him, but everyone he touched. Anna, older as well, had transformed her trauma into a kind of rigid endurance, a way of surviving without hope. Their days were filled with routine, each act of care or cruelty indistinguishable from the other, each small gesture reinforcing the invisible hierarchy Samuel had built. Outside observers could only guess at the level of despair, the subtle horrors that defined every interaction, every decision, every thought. Even now, long after the town became aware, the story retains an almost mythical quality. There are fragments in court records, letters that never found the light, and whispered accounts from those too frightened to testify fully. Scholars of psychology and sociology could dissect the family endlessly, tracing the lines of inherited trauma and obsessive behavior. But the most profound lesson of all is not in the genetic consequence or the social pathology. It is in the quiet erosion of moral boundaries, in how secrecy and isolation can transform ordinary people into instruments of horror without anyone, including themselves, fully realizing it. The final, most haunting aspect of this story is that the darkness does not end with Samuel and Anna. Their children, marked by both genetics and environment, carry forward an imprint that cannot be erased. Each interaction, each decision, each choice they make is shaped by the legacy of control, obsession, and familial transgression. The very air around them, the invisible scaffolding of fear and coercion, molds them into living reminders of a past the world would prefer to forget. History, in this case, is not simply a record of events but a psychological echo, a spectral persistence of wrongdoing and its consequences across generations. This is the story of a family that lived on the edge of morality, whose hidden history challenges our most basic assumptions about kinship, love, and what we consider untouchable. It is a story without catharsis, without simple resolution, because the consequences persist, embedded in living flesh, in bloodlines, in the invisible inheritance of trauma. And the most unsettling truth of all is this: the world contains countless families like Samuel and Anna's, hidden, silent, preserved in quiet corners of the country, carrying histories too dark to tell aloud. Their existence is proof that horror is not always external. Sometimes it is nested within the very people we think we know, concealed behind the comforting facade of a home, a surname, a family dinner. So when you walk past a quiet house, when you glance at a family you believe to be ordinary, remember this: some horrors are not stories of monsters from outside. They are the quiet, relentless accumulation of secrecy, obsession, and generational decay. Samuel and Anna's story is not an anomaly. It is a warning. It is proof that the boundaries we take for granted, between love and possession, family and pathology, morality and madness, are far thinner than we dare admit. And in that truth lies the cold, unshakable fear that some histories, no matter how carefully hidden, are always waiting to be discovered.